Slavery is obviously a very controversial subject that comes up in the Bible, both the Old and the New Testament. In the Old Testament, a Hebrew slave had to be released after 7 years, unless he didn't want to. And then he could be a slave for life. He'd have his ear pierced and he would serve as a slave for the rest of his life. But typically when a Hebrew slave fell into financial trouble and had to sell himself into slavery, which is the situation for most of Hebrew slaves, it was an indentured servanthood. He was to be given his freedom at the end of 7 years. Though the law does say if he didn't want to be free, if actually being a slave was a secure position for him and his family, and he didn't want to be thrust out into the same cruel world where he'd failed before and might fail again and be insecure and end up homeless, he said, no, I like it here. I want to stay here. Well, then he could make that decision and could be a slave for life. Now, the same law did not apply to foreign slaves under the law. Foreign slaves who were maybe prisoners of war, probably most of them were, they didn't get released after 7 years. That was for a Hebrew slave. Now in the New Testament, of course, we're not even talking about the Jewish law. We're talking about Roman law. The Christian church didn't live under Jewish law, so whatever the Old Testament said about slavery was not in their mind or an issue for them. But Roman law was. And as much as half the population of the Roman Empire were slaves, even before anyone got converted there. That means when people did get converted, a great number of them were slaves, and a lot of them were not. Now, slaves under Roman law had very, very little human rights, a little bit like the slaves in this country. Now, slaves in this country were somewhat different because slaves in this country were kidnapped from their homes and treated as if they were not, as a racist kind of thing. Most of the slaves were black, and a great number of the slave owners were white, and it led to a great deal of racial prejudice. Whereas slaves in the Roman Empire, it wasn't so much a racial thing. People were not enslaved because they were of a certain race. They were enslaved because they were enemies in battle who lost and got captured. You know, you fought against us. I guess we could kill you now that we've defeated your country, or we'll just bring you home and you can serve us. That's how the Romans thought. That's how, frankly, almost all societies thought. There's not been a society until England a few centuries ago that didn't have slaves. I mean, when people say, oh, America was built on slavery, you don't know much about history. America is the second country to get rid of slavery after thousands of years of everybody practicing it. Slavery was a very common thing. Now, when Paul wrote, it's clear that Paul believed a slave had as much human rights before God and as much value before God as a free man. But he also was speaking within the confines of the legal system. It wasn't possible for a slave just to walk away from his chains if he was in chains. They probably weren't in chains very often, but still they were slaves. He could, of course, require masters who were Christians to release their slaves. As he said to Philemon, I could tell you to do this. I could make you do it. But then what he's actually doing is asking you to make a financial sacrifice, because slaves cost a fair bit, so, and were considered property in this society. But more than that, not every slave would be happy free, because then they have to make their own living. They have to take care of themselves. Now, lots of slaves could do that. I'm sure a lot of slaves that were kidnapped or prisoners of war could make a living without being slaves. But a lot of people were slaves because they couldn't. Now, it's one thing to say, masters should release their slaves if that's what their slaves want and if that's good for them. It's another thing to say masters should just release their slaves because slavery is a bad thing. Well, is it a bad thing for the slave who made himself a slave because he wanted to, because he couldn't feed his family before he was a slave and now he can? This has nothing to do with the kind of slavery we had here. Here, again, Atlantic slavery, as we call it, or African slavery, we had people of one race not defeating in war, but going and purchasing human beings from another country who, by the way, were captured by people of their same race. We didn't have the white slave traders going over to Africa and hunting them down in the jungles. There were one tribe in Africa captured another tribe and sold them to the white people at the docks. You know, it's like, it's not good. It was a terrible thing. It's an absolutely terrible thing the way it happened. But by the time the slaves were in America, that deed was done. The next question was, what should a Christian do about slavery here? Well, they could just not own slaves, of course, or like I heard some Christians from the South who are often, you know, criticized because they had slaves in the South, say that a lot of the Christians in the South, when the slave ships came in to Florida and places like that, they knew that the next stop was going to be in the Caribbean islands. And the people, the slave owners in the Caribbean were not Christians and were extremely abusive to their slaves. Now, some Americans were abusive to their slaves, but Christian masters were not. Christian masters, when they bought slaves, many times thought, I'm saving this person from the next stop on the itinerary where they'll be sold to someone who's going to treat them like crap. You know, so they actually thought they were saving these slaves. They'd already been kidnapped, you know, so they couldn't necessarily afford to ship them back. I mean, maybe they should have if they're rich enough. But the point is, I'm not trying to make excuses. I'm saying there was a more complex set of things going on. The abolition of slavery is a good thing, especially the slavery we had here, because the slavery we had here was a very bad thing. Kidnapping people is punishable by death in the Jewish law, which tells you that slavery was something different in biblical times than what we had here, because all the slaves who we had here were kidnapped from their homes or else were born from a generation that had been kidnapped. Whereas in the law of Moses, if you kidnap someone, you're put to death, just like if you raped somebody or murdered somebody. And by the way, slaves often were raped and murdered, but not with the sanction of God. There's a world of difference being a servant, let's put it that way, in the home of a godly and loving family, on the one hand, or being a servant in a family where they just you're like a dog. You know, you're like a dog and they like to kick you around and abuse you. There are plenty of slave owners who did that. But that wasn't the whole story. There were other kinds of situations. And when the Emancipation Declaration came, not all the slaves wanted to leave their masters' homes. They had been integrated into families. They were treated like family members. They had a good gig, actually. But obviously many of them did not. And many of them definitely, it's very fortunate that they were released. But in Paul's day, it couldn't be assumed that just abolish slavery, okay, anyone who owns slaves, you have to let them go. Well, what about if the slave didn't want to go? What if he didn't have someplace to go that was as secure? When you aren't a slave and you're free, you also are responsible for your housing, for your food, for your medical, for your clothing, for your family. And of course, a person with a good job can handle that and welcomes those responsibilities. I'd rather have those responsibilities and take care of them than be a slave. I would never really want to be a slave. And I wouldn't want anyone else to have to be a slave. But that doesn't mean that everybody who's ever lived values freedom like we Americans have been conditioned to. We've seen America goes over to certain countries to liberate them from some dictatorial regime, and we think, hey, we made these people free. But they don't want to be free. They elect leaders who are as dictatorial as the previous ones. It's amazing. Freedom is a very Western Christian value. And not everybody is as interested in freedom as they are in security. And in a home where the owners were kind, welcomed these slaves, treated them as family members, fed them well, it was a secure gig for some people who would rather have the security than the liberty. And for Paul to insist that all masters had to shove their slaves out the door might not have been a very happy situation for some of the slaves. I think Paul left that to be negotiated household by household. And I think that was probably the most loving thing to do. And of course, Paul did tell slave owners, treat them justly, treat them equally. Well, okay, that would mean if the slave says, I'd like to be free, well, if you're going to treat them justly and equally, you're going to let them be free. But you might be surprised that there would be people who are in a slave situation who are pretty happy with the situation. And, they don't have something better or more attractive waiting for them out there in the Roman world. That's a pagan world. If they're in a Christian home, nice fellowship, financial security. There's more people than you know that want that. In fact, in America right now, there are more people than you know that would trade in all their freedoms for security. They'd rather have a government that provides their health care, provides their education, provides housing, provides everything they want, even if they give up all their personal rights to their property and to their freedom and freedom of speech and so forth. I don't care, just give me all the goods so I feel secure. And this is something that surprises me, because I would have thought very few people would rather have security than freedom. I don't want any security from the government. I just want to live before God and trust God for my security. Give me all the freedom I can have. And let me have all the responsibility I can take too for my security. But let's face it, look at the elections. People, even in this country, who have departed from God, they don't recognize the value of freedom. They'd rather say, okay, you can take my freedom of this, my freedom of that, my freedom to train my kids, my freedom of worship, my freedom to go to church when there's COVID, my freedom to say what I believe, my freedom to use the pronouns I believe in using. Take all that away from me as long as there's welfare and health care and, I'm going to be secure because the government's going to be my nanny. And all I'm saying is there is a certain mentality that some people have, more than should, who'd rather be secure than free. If someone would rather be free, I think they should be free. But we shouldn't assume that everybody throughout history in all cultures have valued freedom like we have. Very few people have had freedom to even know whether they value it or not. They live with what they've got, and it's not very good. Yeah, obviously, if we had slaves here, I'm sure there wouldn't be very many slaves would be happy to be, and if you're a Christian, you should let them go. But force them to go when they may not actually prefer that, that's something Paul did not do. But Paul did indicate that Christians should be prepared to release their slaves for the advantage of the kingdom of God, as he was asking Philemon to do, to release Onesimus and maybe other slaves too. If they were given freedom and were more free to serve the kingdom of God and were going to do that, I'm sure Paul would recommend that be done every time.